Hi, everybody. This week we are going to be talking about social problems in education. So, in our last module, we finished talking about social problems pertaining to poverty, and we got a much clearer picture about how social class inequality and the unequal distribution of wealth in the United States attributes to a number of different social problems. Many of those are connected to social problems in education, right? Typically in the US, we think that the solution to getting out of poverty often involves getting a higher paying job. And in order to get a higher paying job in the United States, you oftentimes need to have a higher level of education. So these are definitely social problems that are linked to one another. Social problems in education typically result in social problems pertaining to social class inequalities and disparities. And many of these specific problems in education are very much linked to other demographic variables. Excuse me. Like we've been saying throughout this course thus far, all social problems need to be viewed through an intersectional lens, right? We can't just study social problems in education without also recognizing social problems pertaining to social class inequalities, racism, sexism, etc. And much of that is going to become very apparent today. So this presentation in particular, I've kind of built as an extension of our previous discussion on social problems pertaining to poverty. And poverty and specifically race are going to be the two variables that become very important in our discussion of education. And I know we haven't specifically unpacked social problems pertaining to racism yet. We're going to be covering that material next week, but you'll definitely get some insight as to how social problems pertaining to education are connected to social problems pertaining to poverty and social class inequalities, and how both of these different sectors of social inequalities are inextricably connected to social problems pertaining to race and racism. So I asked you to view a few different TED Talks this week. The first one came from an individual named Victor Rios. And the big takeaway I hope you got from listening to this TED Talk is just another person's perspective, kind of echoing the sentiment that I've been saying from the jump in this course, is that we can't expect an individual to be able to pull themselves out of any different social problem alone, right? And I think Victor Rios summed it up very well, saying grit alone isn't going to cut it, right? He went on to say something that I've been saying, echoing throughout this course, this idea that any individual can simply pull themselves up by the bootstraps and kind of escalate their way out of any sort of problem they're experiencing in life, or to improve their quality of life by their own individual merit. And as Victor Rios said in here, in his lived experience, that was very much not attainable. And that's true for the majority of people that are experiencing severe forms of marginalization and discrimination in the United States. To just overcome a system or a structure of inequality is not something that is easily achievable by any given individual, especially if you are experiencing multiple forms of oppression and discrimination. Victor went into great detail sharing the insights of his childhood, where he grew up in a very poor neighborhood where crime was very common. Talks about, seeing his uncle die in front of his very eyes, and seeing how long it took simply to get an ambulance or a first responder to the crime scene because the neighborhood that he lived in was somewhere that society has cast off as being lower class and therefore lower quality and less deserving of being treated with human dignity. And I thought it was so powerful. I remember the first time I watched this TED Talk, it literally brought me to tears. When Victor said, I had lost faith and hope in the world, and I had given up on the system because the system had failed me, right? So he was simply talking about this system that he was living in, right? He lived in a poor neighborhood, and because of that, the quality of education that he was receiving was poor by and large. The treatment of his people, predominantly people of lower socioeconomic status, and predictably, given what we know about housing patterns and segregation, predominantly people of color who were people of low socioeconomic status, were being treated as less than. They were being treated as less than human, simply based off of these sociodemographic factors that get worsened and affect the treatment of people living in those conditions, because we've been taught to have this mindset that if you have grit, if you have determination, anybody can bring themselves out of a negative situation. Anybody can improve their quality of life if only they work hard enough. And I share his experience here. So, it's not just me telling you something as one teacher, someone who's experienced a lot of privilege. As a white person that came from a lower middle class family, I never worried about whether or not I was going to have food on the table when I came home as a child. I didn't worry about violence in my neighborhood where I grew up. I had a lot of privilege. So I'm presenting his story so you can hear this coming from another individual. And there's millions of other people similar to Victor who can attest to this far more personally than I ever could, coming from my position of privilege in the intersections of my identity that I've been afforded privilege on. But it's so imperative. I need you to understand, in order to succeed in this course, that these problems are so pervasive, and that simply believing that any individual has the capability to resurrect themselves out of these negative circumstances that they're a part of is what enables these problems to extend themselves across generations, right? So I beg you to think about this question. Have you ever felt so disadvantaged in your life? Have you ever felt that you've experienced so much discrimination, that you have experienced so much oppression, that you have ever lost all faith in the world? Think how powerful of a statement that is, that people are feeling this way in the United States today, right? Now, Victor goes on to tell us about how fortunate he was to have one single individual in his life, in this instance, a teacher, Miss Russ, who cared about Victor so much that she was willing to go out of her way to ensure that he knew that he could achieve things, and that she was going to help him work hard to get out of this trap that he was falling into, to get out of this negative cycle of living in poverty, of potentially falling prey to living a life of crime just in order to survive. Victor was privileged in that he was going to a school where there was at least one teacher there that was willing to go above and beyond what was expected of themselves to help their students and to try and help them succeed. But what do you think happens to the millions of students in the United States who, unlike Victor, don't have a teacher like Ms. Russ, who, unlike Victor, don't have any sort of support or encouragement, either in their families, in their social circles, in the institutions that they're a part of? What happens to those millions of individuals if you don't have anyone telling you or helping you navigate these structures of oppression, right? How are you expected, as Victor says, to pull yourself up by the bootstraps if you don't have any bootstraps to pull yourself up by in the first place, right? Echoing the quote that Dr. Martin Luther King stated that we went over in the first week of class. How dare you tell someone to pull themselves up by their boots if they don't have any boots to begin with, right? And education is an important aspect for us as sociologists to begin understanding the complexities of social problems, because it's, first of all, a social structure that we as Americans get introduced to at a very young age, right? As early as 3, 4, 5 years, we start getting indoctrinated into some form of formal schooling and education. And it becomes critically important to our success as adults, and measuring success in terms of our abilities to achieve upward social mobility, because we've created the system in our society where without education, at least without a high school degree, and becoming more increasingly common without a college degree, it becomes very difficult to secure a job that enables any given US citizen to live above the poverty line in the United States. And as we're going to unpack today, unfortunately, the system of education in the United States is really heavily indoctrinated with many unequal social structures that negatively treat students of color, that negatively treat students of lower socioeconomic status, that negatively treat women. Virtually every marginalized group experiences some form of structural inequality in the system of education. And so that's what we're going to be taking a closer look at today. So just to kind of paint a broader picture to help you understand how structural inequality in education is linked to poverty and linked to other social problems, I want to take a second to take a look at these maps here. And now these are 3 different maps of the city of Chicago, all right? Chicago is a city that's really interesting from a sociological perspective because there's a great amount of inequality within the city, particularly in terms of neighborhood segregation and the inequalities that stem from that. So this first map on the left here that I'd like to draw your attention to, that has shows all the neighborhoods within the city limits of Chicago. And there are different shades of green here, as you'll see. Now, the darker shades of green represent neighborhoods that have higher property values. And the lighter shades of green here represent neighborhoods that have lower property values. Okay, so what you'll quickly notice here is that there is obviously a very stark contrast between the north side of Chicago, specifically the northeastern part of Chicago here, which is also referred to as the Gold Coast, in comparison to the south side of Chicago. Now, the south side of Chicago is notoriously known as one of the poorest, most dangerous parts of any city in the United States. And what we are seeing here is that the property values on the south side are very, very low, right? Almost white in comparison to the property values on the northeastern part of Chicago, where many of these neighborhoods are very, very dark green, okay? So property values, right? The cost of housing in the northeastern part of Chicago, significantly higher than in the south side of Chicago. The next map here with purple hues represents the quality of schools in each of Chicago's different neighborhoods. All right, the same premise here. The darker the neighborhood is, the higher quality the schools are. The lighter colored the neighborhood is, the closer to white, the poorer quality, the worst qualities of schools. All right. Now, what you should notice here is that if we laid this purple map on top of the green map, we would see that the quality of schools map almost exactly on top of the property values for any given neighborhood, right? These dark purple clusters here that show the highest quality of schools map almost perfectly on top of these dark green clusters here, which indicate the highest property values. And again, the almost white colored here, which represent the worst quality schools in Chicago, map almost perfectly on top of the poorest neighborhoods, the lowest property values in the city of Chicago. Now, why is this? Why is this? Well, you may not know this, but the public schools in any given city are directly funded by the property tax values within their school districts. So another way to frame that is that the more money that people have, the more they pay for housing in any neighborhood, the more money that the schools within that neighborhood, specifically within that independent school district, receive. So richer neighborhoods get more funding to their public schools, as we see here. Poorer neighborhoods, where property values are very lower, generate fewer tax dollars in terms of property taxes, and therefore have less money to pay to their public schools. So we see a very, very stark contrast in the quality of schools based off of the income of people living in those neighborhoods. Okay, so we're going to get back to this. We'll take a closer look at this and a few other examples, but one more map I want to lay on top of these other two show crime rates in the city of Chicago. So here again, you see the lighter shaded neighborhoods in this instance. Again, look at the northeast part of Chicago particularly, have the lowest crime rates. The south side of Chicago, very clearly the dark blue here, the highest crime rates. So what we see very clearly by these maps is that the higher the property values in any given neighborhood, the higher the quality of schools, and the lower rates of crime, right? And as we'll talk about, this makes sense because oftentimes in poor neighborhoods that have very poor quality of schools, we are likely going to see students that are of lower socioeconomic status. Those students tend to be people of color, and those people of color, specifically those young people of color who are students, are over-criminalized. They're more likely to be convicted of crimes. They're more likely to be expelled or suspended from schools, which increases their likelihood of engaging in criminal activity because they are not being supervised when they should be by their schools. And as a result, we see disproportionate amounts of crime in these low socioeconomic status neighborhoods that primarily are occupied by people of color. So these three simple maps are showing us again how intersectional things like socioeconomic status, education, crime, and race, if we look at this fourth map here, are interconnected to one another. Look at this race map of Chicago here. So the blue areas, the blue neighborhoods, again, the northeast part of Chicago predominantly, are predominantly white. The south side of Chicago, predominantly Black and Hispanic, right? So these four maps, again, almost perfectly lay on top of each other here. We see higher higher property rates associated with higher quality schools, lower rates of crime in white neighborhoods, and on the flip side, the lower property values are associated with poor quality schools, higher rates of crime in communities that are predominantly occupied by people of color.